thank you for the enrichment you've brought to all of us today with this great occasion and all the work that it takes. Thank you for the enrichment even back to my son Robert in those great years at Campion. I've found that just about everyone I meet here has got some connection either to Robert or to his wife or to my other son's wife. So it's terrific. It's lovely to be here among friends at such a complex time in our cultural history. I remember being here for the first Dawson colloquium. This is the 7th, isn't it? And that was in 2015, and Robert also spoke at that one. And it was also our wedding anniversary, so my wife Jane came down, and it snowed, I remember, during the convention. But being a romantic type, I actually spent the evening before with the only gay guy I know in Tasmania. And this was Rodney Croom, and we had a very long and respectful debate on ABC Radio Hobart on same-sex marriage. Now, I only mention that so that I've got an opportunity to reference Archbishop Porteous, which I believe is a condition of being here today. Because during that discussion with Rodney Croom, it was shortly after the controversy, I don't know why there was one, but there was a controversy over the bishop's booklet sent to the parishioners of various Catholic schools called Don't Mess with Marriage. You will remember that. And Rodney Croom, of course, got agitated about this book and got a transgender Greens candidate to lodge a complaint, and then Archbishop Porteous was taken through the process. And I said to Rodney Croom during this debate, I said, Rodney, you don't set government lawyers onto people that you disagree with. You don't take the Archbishop to the thought police because you don't like the tone in his book. That's not how free men in a free society settle disputes. But of course, that's increasingly how it is done, isn't it? Lawfare to intimidate us conservatives or Christians into being quiet, or if we say anything, getting into the mill of the legal process. So I guess what we've learned today from all those splendid but sobering papers we've listened to is that the better angels of Western civilization, like the elves of Middle-earth, have been fighting the long defeat. Those who despise our Judeo-Christian heritage now control the high ground of our culture, particularly the fields of education, media, medicine, law, and global politics. The task for all of us who love the world that flows from Bethlehem, not Mordor or Beijing, is now to stake out and fiercely defend our own cultural space against those who would impose their alien ways. And this is steady work. Since the 1990s, I've played a small supporting role to our faithful pro-life and pro-family organisations as we sought to hammer 4 defiant stakes into the ground, defining that moral domain that we will not relinquish and where our children's children will still be able to live in relative liberty, sanity and innocence. So those 4 stakes rejected the killing of our offspring, the killing of our parents, the desecrating of human life through embryo experimentation, and the trashing of the human trinity, man, woman, child, through homosexual marriage and gender ideology. Now, around those 4 stakes, we place a boundary rope, a line that shall not be crossed, an assertion of our inalienable liberties of thought, conscience, speech and association, such as we've been exercising so freely today. For we are proud citizens of a free country, and we claim our birthright. Even an outsider like St. Paul had a proper pride as a Roman citizen, and he upbraided that centurion in Jerusalem for manhandling him. We, like Paul, are citizens of no mean city. Even if we have no abiding city, even if the streets of some demoralised Western cities with their toppled statues and their Antifa mobs are getting meaner by the day, we too will assert our hard-won civic liberty to speak according to conscience and live not by lies. Defending this boundary line of core liberties will be hard, but we will do it. It is true, as the elven Lord Elrond told Gandalf the Grey, that, quote, the list of our allies grows thin. But how invigorating it is to be part of this countercultural resistance, a fellowship of free people. A day may come, said Aragorn, you remember? When the courage of men fails, when we flee before the orc filth of woke atheist culture. But it is not this day. Today we fight men of the West. And so I have asked 3 men of the West to help focus our minds on this fight, to give us their best one-liner that clarifies a key element of today's colloquium, which, as you recall, was freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the essence of Western civilization. Mr. John Milton will get to the heart of free speech. Sir Winston Churchill will define civilization. Professor Christopher Dawson will show the centrality of religion to the culture war that engulfs us, in which our only weapons are free speech and deep conviction. Give me the liberty to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. John Milton, 400 years ago, appealing to the British Parliament not to enact certain laws that would prohibit unacceptable opinions being published. Free speech means free argument. It's the expression of free thought. And the thoughts that matter most to individuals are those formed out of deep conscientious struggle. Without free thought and free argument, we are not free citizens or even free souls. We lose the capacity to defend our deepest convictions and therefore lose the essence of our humanity, which is to live according to what we judge to be true and right. Free speech, which means free argument, is at the heart of a society that settles its disputes by debate, not by guns. It should not be a partisan issue. As the greatest free speech warrior of the West, Canadian journalist Mark Steyn has said, free speech is not a left-right thing, it is a free, unfree thing. And yet the liberty to argue freely according to conscience is being constricted throughout the Western world in the name of a new and bogus right not to be offended. Steyn speaks from experience, quote, in Canada, I committed the crime of offending certain approved identity groups. And there is no defence to that. Truth, facts, evidence are all irrelevant. If someone's offended, that's it. You are guilty. End quote. Now, thanks to Steyn's magnificent pushback against the Canadian human rights establishment, the Canadian Parliament repealed the vilification law under which he was harassed. Some things can be achieved. In Australia, that's unfinished business. Whether with Section 18C or the lack of religious freedom legislation at the federal level or the human rights tribunals in various states that exist solely to suppress the human rights of free speech and free conscience. With free speech, it's a matter of use it or lose it. Even though standing on your soapbox does make you an easy target. In my case, that has meant the vandalism of my medical practice by an anarchist painting Van Gendt's bigot in red paint across the walls, threats of assault and death during the marriage campaign, which the police had to monitor, attempted sabotage, in my view, by the Sydney bosses of a big printing company contracted to print my book, Stealing from a Child, a book against same-sex marriage, because they said of its content. It became a bestseller and none of the LGBT group could lay a hand on it. No longer content, but they banned it. Anyway, it still went well. An online petition was set up to have me stripped of my medical licence because I held these unacceptable opinions on marriage. But look, this is nothing compared to what other friends put up, such as Lyle Shelton's office being bombed by a gay activist with an anti-religious grudge when Lyle was head of the ACL. Or others who've lost employment because they publicly supported the No campaign on same-sex marriage. For example, Madeline, a teenager we met at Lyle's and Monica Dumit's marriage campaign headquarters in Canberra. Madeline had posted our slogan, "It's okay to say no," to Facebook, and in response her employer sacked her. 8 months later, Monica reported in the Catholic Weekly that the Fair Work Ombudsman had upheld the right of the employer to sack Madeline for putting that on Facebook. That's the cost in today's Australia of expressing a traditional viewpoint of a timeless institution. But beyond these vandals and the trolls and the corporate bullies, we now have woke state agencies doing the bidding of vexatious activists. In my case, this has meant ludicrous cases eventually thrown out, before the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal of Queensland and the Medical Board of Australia for publishing mainstream views on marriage and gender that offended LGBT activists. So, people, against this fake right not to be offended, we should affirm that being offended is part of the price of freedom. Hearing things that offend is unavoidable in a society that governs itself by free argument, not by violence. Therefore, fellow citizens, let us take offence in our stride as part of our civic duty. Or go live in a nice totalitarian society like China where there is no offence because thought and argument have been crushed into a soulless, offenceless pulp. The whole question of our core freedoms was meant to be addressed by the 2018 Ruddock Review of Religious Freedom. It was so strange when I addressed this committee to find that the head of the Australian Human Rights Commission was on that committee, given that the only effective way to protect freedom of speech and religion in this age of vexatious offence-taking would be to defang such commissions who prowl the boundaries of acceptable beliefs. But Professor Rosalind Croucher was courteous when I spoke with the committee, even though I had been blunt in the submission that she had before her, where I said the Australian Human Rights Commission has no mandate to act as the national arbiter of acceptable opinion. For Australian law to adequately protect freedom of conscience and religion, the human rights apparatus will have to be relieved of its power to intimidate citizens who express conscientious convictions that are well-founded but out of step with the spirit of the age, end quote. One thinks of the late great cartoonist Bill Leake, whose conscience-pricking depiction of the plight of Aboriginal children resulted in relentless and despicable intimidation by our Human Rights Commission that almost certainly hastened his death. A reasonable supposition. I also said to the Ruddock Committee that their inquiry marks a watershed moment, and I said this: right now we can either reaffirm the primacy of the individual conscience, an unusual idea that arose from the unprecedented importance of the individual soul in Christian culture, or we can give primacy to the group conscience of identity politics and sink slowly back into the collectivism characteristic of human history, end quote. The greatest affirmation of the individual against the collective comes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which opens thus: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now note, the epitome of human dignity is reason and conscience, not yet religion. That comes later in Article 18, which says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This is an important point. This threefold freedom is at the heart of human rights: thought, conscience and religion, because it's at the heart of human life. These are the freedoms that throughout history men and women would die for. The priority that is given to conscience over religion in this Declaration of Human Rights is important because even agnostics need conscientious freedom. Conscience is that primal faculty of the human soul that can perceive right and wrong. It's the Aboriginal vicar of Christ, as St. John Henry Newman put it. and it operates with the same supernatural dignity even in those with no religious worldview. And so it was a pleasure to see that the Ruddock Review's final report opens with the words, "Freedom of thought, conscience and religion is a right enjoyed by all, not just those of faith." Now, faced with that opening statement, a wiser parliament than the one we just had would have broadened its proposed legislation beyond a religious discrimination bill to include freedom of conscience, whether religious or agnostic, for all of us. And wiser parliaments than any we've had, state and federal, would repeal all of these offence-taking laws. And then these laws would have been found to be unnecessary as well as unworthy. Because where free speech strays into personal attack, we already have laws against defamation and already against incitement to violence. That is enough. Give me the liberty to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties, especially when such arguments offend prevailing orthodoxy. So, our second great Western man, Sir Winston Churchill, defines civilization for us as a society based upon the opinion of civilians, not upon the approved opinion of the elite in their globalist institutions or their social media monopolies or their anti-discrimination tribunals, not upon the rule of the Black Lives Matter mob, tearing down anything they don't like or can't understand. Civilization means a society based upon the opinion, the free speech of civilians. Churchill continues, it means that violence, the rule of warriors and despotic chiefs, of riot and tyranny, gives place to parliaments where laws are made. Independent courts of justice in which over long periods those laws are maintained. That is civilization. And in its soil grow continually freedom, comfort and culture, end quote. Well, those cultural forces that hate Western civilization, and especially British civilization, are relentless in undermining its foundations. We have to be relentless in shoring up those foundations, and understanding what I think is the main source of our strength may help us to stand firm. And that main source is our culture's deep institutional foundation in religion. When the future King George V opened the first Commonwealth Parliament in 1901, British Australia was already a 1,000-year-old Christian monarchy. When my grandparents attended the Queen's coronation in 1953 as representatives of Northern Rhodesia, the oath that they heard Queen Elizabeth take was little changed from the coronation oath of King Edgar 1,000 years earlier, 973, where he vowed to defend the land, uphold its laws, protect its church, and rule justly. And in turn, Edgar's anointing as king was modelled on the anointing of King Solomon, almost 2,000 years earlier. The only moment at the Queen's coronation that was hidden from the television viewer was the anointing, as that was deemed a sacred moment between the monarch and God, the Queen being the head of the Church of England and defender of the faith. Now, a culture like ours with a deep foundation in Christian faith will hold a high view of the individual soul and its dignity. As you excavate down into 2,000 years of Christian civilization among the English-speaking people, you'll find an unwavering conviction that individual liberty must triumph over the tyranny of kings and that all of us are equal before the law and under God. And so, obviously, with Magna Carta, the great Charter of Liberties in 1215, bad King John and his abuses had to be brought to heel by the barons at Runnymede. You may remember A.A. Milne's poem. A.A. Milne's poem, King John was not a good man. He had his little ways, and sometimes no one spoke to him for days and days and days. But thanks to this bad monarch, the world got the foundational document upon which government of the people, by the people, for the people would be constructed. So people, this Anglo-Saxon British culture of which we are the heirs and custodians has been the most successful ever in creating stable democracy throughout the world and the most resolute in resisting tyranny. It's a heritage of liberty in which freedom of speech and freedom of religion have until recently been more honoured than in any other culture at any other time. So we are citizens of no mean civilization. And finally, to Christopher Dawson, our third great man of the West. He teaches us so eloquently that culture is embodied religion, an enfleshment of religion over time. Culture is the sum of the ways in which religion becomes embodied in material forms and patterns of life. And Dawson talks about that vital process of enculturation, by which culture is handed on by society and acquired by the individual. Well, Western civilization has a crisis now of enculturation, or the lack of it. In our schools and universities and public life, our own culture is not being handed on by society. Indeed, it is being trashed in the minds of the young. But, because nature abhors a vacuum, rival cultures are rushing in as the embodiment of alien religions. And these two dominant alien religions at work in our culture are atheist and pantheist. And we must remember C.S. Lewis's warning that it is pantheism, not atheism, that poses the greatest threat to monotheism. That is because atheism, being ultimately nihilistic, can only tear down. The communists have never built anything of lasting beauty. Think of that. Pantheism is not nihilistic, and it can build up. It draws its energy from a transcendent mysticism of unity with earth and cosmos, along with the frisson of sexual license that goes with all nature worship. Now that is a viable culture-forming religion. Communism begins where atheism begins, says Marx. And communist animosity, above all to the family, was heightened by the perception that someone alluded to, that family and religion are intertwined in Western culture. After all, the iconic image of Christianity is the mother and child. Marx wrote this: after the earthly family is discovered as the secret of the holy family, the former, the earthly family, must be theoretically and practically destroyed. End quote. The great atheist saw that there's something quasi-sacred about the earthly trinity of father, mother and child, and it had to be destroyed as part of the destruction of religion. The church was the one relentless enemy of the totalitarians from the days of Marx until the visit of Pope John Paul II to communist Poland in 1979, which tipped the first domino that brought down the Berlin Wall a decade later. But meantime, so much damage to religion and family had already been done. From the mid-20th century, Marxist Freudians had realised that fundamental transformation of society would ultimately come not through economic changes, but through vast cultural, sexual changes undermining family and married life. Sex could be a devastating instrument if permitted to run rampant, and so they advocated the elimination of all sexual restraints, along with the destruction of the family, religion, and bourgeois morality. We heard of Marcuse. There was a series of the Frankfurt School all working on this. The final blow, of course, was legalising same-sex marriage. The atheist revolutionaries knew that to deconstruct marriage is to deconstruct the family and destroy the very notion of a natural order. For as we, Lyle, Monica, me, all of us said endlessly during the marriage debate, if we reject the natural truth of man and woman in marriage, we reject the natural truth of mother and father in parenting, and we ultimately reject the natural reality of male and female itself. All becomes a genderless, government-defined, nihilistic chaos, which is exactly the objective of the radicals. who now control the high ground of our culture. So the atheists tear down, but the eco-pantheists, the green pantheists, build up the new culture. They do this by capturing the minds of children, using intense cult-like fear and heavy moral authority to compel children's belief in the coming apocalypse. Over 9 wasted years, the coalition government failed utterly to expel apocalyptic junk science from the national curriculum, and so failed to combat the deep green terrorising of our children, who now take to the streets weeping over the imminent end of the world, raging against capitalists, meat eaters and other enemies of the planet. And I see anxious children where this is the content. Now, for younger adults, crusading for real action to save the planet can give their lives a serious and even transcendent purpose. It also meets a religious need, providing a form of animist pantheist spirituality to souls who have long drifted from their monotheistic moorings. Think of that powerfully pantheistic movie Avatar, where the morally pure, deep green creatures on the planet Pandora confront the evil mining barons from Central Casting, who would violate Awa, the mother spirit of the planet. But today at Sydney University, you are invited to a conference called Nature Feels, with a Z, whose organisers say they are, quote, interested in what it would mean to consider the ecological emotions of beings other than human. Former Climate Commissioner Tim Flannery went the full Gaia in an interview with The Guardian, proclaiming, listen, we are on the edge of creating a global superorganism in which the collective human mind will commune with the earth goddess. Listen to his exact words. Quote, Tim Flannery, Climate Commissioner, I think this global superorganism, this global intelligence, will be able to send a single strong and clear signal to the earth. And what that means, in a sense, is that we will be a regulating intelligence for the planet. We will do what our brain does for our body, which is to help create stability, coordination between the parts, and lead to a stronger Gaia, if you like, a stronger Earth system, end quote. Climate Commissioner. Now, Flannery's stronger Gaia requires global groupthink, what he calls a global community with a common set of beliefs, end quote. Sending a single strong and clear message to the earth. Well, this may be a disturbing fantasy, but all totalitarian systems start off as mere disturbing fantasies. How much tolerance will there be for freedom of speech and of belief when those who dare oppose the cult of Gaia are condemned as enemies of the planet? That is our very near future. So, as we conclude this cheerful end of civilization tale, what hope is there for the good old faith of our fathers? Yes, our list of allies is growing thin, but in any epic, there are going to be unexpected and sometimes hopeful twists to the plot. Consider two such. Groups of fellow travellers whose insights might inject new energy into our ancient religion and therefore into our culture. These are certain agnostic psychologists and agnostic scientists. Both groups resonate with that deepest idea of our faith. An idea captured in 5 words of Greek, written on parchment in the 1st century, words which had the power then to create a culture and which have the power to recreate it now. Kai hologos sarx egeneto, and the Word became flesh. The mind of God became man. Now, just this week, a clip of psychologist Jordan Peterson appeared on John Anderson's Conversations website. The two men were speaking about the centrality of free speech in Western civilization, obviously aware of this impending colloquium. And Jordan Peterson said this, listen, the idea of logos in the West is the most sacred concept. If you think about this psychologically, Christ is the ideal of perfection. One of the things the West has settled on is that the perfect individual utters the truthful speech that makes potential into habitable order. That's embedded in the first few sentences in Genesis, when God brings the world into being. It is an unbelievably remarkable idea, says Jordan Peterson, that individual perfection is to be found in the relationship with spoken truth. That's the great idea. Out of that arises the observation there's nothing more central to the hierarchy of rights than freedom of speech. That's why Christ is the Word made flesh, says Jordan Peterson. If you want to take down the West, you remove the idea of the divine word from the substructure of society. End quote. Not bad for an agnostic. Conversely, of course, if we want to build up the West, you've got to restore the idea of the divine word. Agnostics like Peterson, even though his Jungian psychology is really a benign takeover bid for Christianity, but even so, he brings the idea of the divine logos back to the Western mind. Long may his free speech flourish, although I note he's just been cancelled by Twitter. But even more exciting, finally, is that group of scientists who profess no faith, but who perceive through their science what they call the mind of God, in the deep rationality of the natural world. Einstein, who saw further into the cosmos than any of us. He writes, everyone who is seriously engaged in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that the laws of nature manifest the existence of a spirit vastly superior to that of men, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble, end quote. He describes how, quote, a conviction akin to religious feeling of the rationality or intelligibility of the world lies behind all scientific work of a higher order. This firm belief, he says, a belief bound up with deep feeling in a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience, that represents my conception of God, end quote. This lapsed Jew is teaching us once more the fear of the Lord. And that might again be the beginning of wisdom for our culture. An agnostic Australian scientist, Paul Davies, wrote an entire book called The Mind of God. He describes how through my scientific work, I've come to believe more and more strongly that the physical universe is put together with an ingenuity so astonishing that I cannot accept it merely as a brute fact. There must, it seems to me, be a deeper level of explanation, end quote. And the late, great Anthony Flew, described as the world's most notorious atheist philosopher, was smitten by the same scientific beauty. In his turn of the century book, There Is a God, he writes, I now believe that the universe was brought into being by an infinite intelligence. I believe that this universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. Why do I believe this? Given that I've expounded and defended atheism for more than a half century? The short answer is, this is the world picture, as I see it, that has emerged from modern science, end quote. So these reverent agnostics are not far from the first line of the Christian creed, that we believe in the mind of God, the almighty creator of heaven and earth, of all things, visible and invisible. Now, if the wider culture were to come to that reverent deistic position, how much more interest there would be when we propose the next lines of the creed. The culture creating claim that for our sake and for our salvation, this mind of God, for reasons of its own, apparently because he loves us, became flesh and dwelt amongst us. That's our proposition, but it'd be nice if the culture at least got to the first line, wouldn't it? Now, I don't know if Anthony Flew took that second step before he died, but his unflinching integrity made him ask this: where do I go from here? The question of whether the divine has revealed itself in human history remains a valid topic of discussion. You cannot limit the possibilities of omnipotence. That'd be a good school slogan. But even if it's not a school slogan, Your Grace, I want on the wall of every science classroom in every Catholic and Christian school, I want the words of the great astronomer Johannes Kepler, who discovered the laws of planetary motion. We are simply thinking God's thoughts after him. I guess it's far from clear that Cath Ed would allow such a bold expression of free speech and religious conviction. So, ladies and gentlemen, Christians will remain proud citizens of no mean city, and we will defend the noblest liberties of our civilization, even as the barbarians reduce it to rubble, because we know that the liberty to speak what is true and to love what is good is ours by right, as minds made to resonate with the mind of God. But for now, our happy counter-cultural band is in much the same position as the Fellowship of the Ring, stuck deep in the mines of Moria, surrounded by filthy orcs. Says Frodo to Gandalf, I wish none of this had happened. Says Gandalf, so all together now, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides that of evil, and that is an encouraging thought. End quote. Thank you.
Archbishop, would you care to do anything you want to say?
What does one say after that? David, that was magnificent, a tour de force. Thank you. Let's give him another round of applause.
Takes our breath away, doesn't it? It was just a wonderful ending to our colloquium. But fully consistent with the general standard of papers that we've had. I don't recall anything so consistently good as this one we've had this year, and I'm so grateful to you, David, and to all you speakers at our colloquium, and it's so thrilling to see it all come together. I remember last year hearing Diff, as I now know him. Well, he was Kenneth then, as far as I'm overhearing him saying to somebody, "See you next year." And I was very touched by that. That stuck in my mind. And, well, he's here. I don't know that the person you said that to is, but it's lovely to have this gathering of so many wonderful, friendly... I found it simply inspiring. And I'm very thrilled. And I'm very grateful to Adam, too, for filming this, because it's all in the can, as I think we say in the film industry. And will be shown put on the net and and of course published. So God bless you all, and thank you so much for coming to the Athens of the South.